Hospitals never sleep, but the nights are the quietest. The hum of machines, the soft beeping of monitors, the occasional shuffle of footsteps down long white hallways. I've worked the night shift as a nurse for nearly 11 years, and there are things you get used to, shadows that look like people, but are just equipment. The way fluorescent lights flicker sometimes for no reason. But there was one night that changed everything. I thought I understood about this place. It was a rainy Tuesday, the kind of night where thunder rolls low in the distance and wind taps gently on the windows like a forgotten visitor. Most of the patients were asleep, and my rounds were simple. Everything felt normal until I saw her. A little girl in a pale hospital gown, standing at the far end of the hallway, holding a teddy bear. At first I thought she was just a patient who had wandered out of her room. I glanced at the chart list to see who she might be, but there were no pediatric patients admitted that night. We were a small ward, mostly post-surgery recovery and elderly care. There should not have been any children here at all. I walked toward her, calling out softly so I would not scare her. She turned and looked at me, her eyes too wide, too still. I felt a chill then, one that made the tiny hairs on my arms rise, even though the air was warm. She did not speak. She simply turned and skipped away, disappearing around the corner. I followed, but the hallway was empty when I got there. No sound, no little feet, nothing. I checked the security cameras with the guard downstairs. He was half asleep, sipping coffee and watching an old TV show. When I asked if he had seen a little girl on the monitors, he looked confused. He rewound the footage and played it back for me. I could see myself walking down the hallway, calling out to someone, but there was no little girl, just me, talking to the empty corridor. I laughed nervously, said maybe I was just tired, and the guard shrugged, but the image of that child stuck in my head. Her blank stare, her dirty teddy bear, the way she skipped without sound. I could not shake it. The next night, I was on shift again. I almost asked to switch, but I did not want to seem crazy. I kept thinking maybe it had been a dream, or a trick of the light. The night began quietly. I did my rounds, checked vitals, gave meds. Around 3 a.m., I heard laughter, high-pitched and soft, like a child trying not to be heard. It echoed faintly through the hallway. I froze. The sound came from the old supply wing, a section of the hospital that had been shut down for renovations years ago, but was never finished. No one went in there anymore. The doors were supposed to be locked, but when I got there, one was slightly open, just enough for me to push it with 2 fingers. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old disinfectant. I walked slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The laughter came again, but this time it sounded closer. I turned a corner and saw her. She was sitting on the floor, playing with her teddy bear, rocking back and forth. I asked her gently if she was okay, but she did not look up. She whispered something to the bear, then started singing, a lullaby, soft and broken, like she only remembered parts of it. I felt frozen in place. I wanted to leave, but something made me stay. She stopped singing and finally looked at me. Her eyes were black, not like dark-colored eyes. I mean no white at all, just endless black. I stumbled backward and ran. I did not stop until I reached the nurse station. I told my coworker what happened, but she gave me a strange look. She said I must have been dreaming on my feet, that it happens during long shifts. But the next morning, I talked to one of the older nurses who had worked here for decades. I described the little girl. Her face went pale. She told me there was once a fire in the old pediatric wing, back when that side of the hospital was still running. One child had died, a little girl who had been left alone for just a few minutes while her nurse went to get her medicine. The fire spread fast, and by the time they got to her, it was too late. She was found holding a melted teddy bear. Her body was never moved from the site because of how badly the structure collapsed. The hospital built over it, but kept that wing sealed off. No one had seen her since, until now. After that, I refused to work night shifts. I could not walk those hallways without hearing that lullaby echoing faintly in the corners. Other nurses started whispering too, about toys moving on their own, about doors opening at night, about cold spots in the old supply wing. One even said she found tiny footprints leading into a locked room. We never told the patients. Hospitals have enough fear without ghosts. But those of us who work the night shift, we know. The little girl in the gown is still here, still wandering, still waiting for someone to come back for her. And if you ever hear soft laughter when the halls are empty, do not follow it. Some children are never meant to leave. There are moments in nursing when everything seems ordinary, when the patients are asleep, the machines are humming softly, and the world outside the hospital feels far away. You do your rounds, check vitals, administer medications, and prepare for the next shift. But there are also moments that shatter the calm, moments that you cannot explain, no matter how many years you've spent in the job. I remember one such night clearly, like it happened only yesterday. I had been working a late shift in the ICU, doing what I always did, checking on my patients, making sure they were comfortable, and adjusting their drips. One of the patients, an elderly man, had been in a coma for days, and doctors had declared him brain dead earlier that evening. His family had been told to say their goodbyes. As I entered his room, I noted the steady beep of his heart monitor, though I knew it would be only a matter of hours before the inevitable happened. It was a sad, quiet moment. I went about my duties, adjusting his sheets and monitoring his oxygen levels, but something felt strange. As I stood there by his side, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The room felt colder than usual, the air thicker, almost suffocating. I brushed it off as exhaustion from the long shift. Then, as I was about to step out, something happened that made me freeze in my tracks. The man, who had been lifeless just moments before, whispered my name, Maggie. It was so faint, barely audible, yet it was unmistakable. I turned sharply, certain I had heard wrong, but his eyes remained closed, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, completely unresponsive. I checked the monitors again, confirming that he was still brain dead, but the whisper had felt real, like a voice trying to get through from the other side. A chill ran through me. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind. Exhaustion can cause all sorts of things to seem real when they're not. I went to the nurse's station to update the charts and tell the on-call doctor about the situation. When I returned, everything was the same. His heart monitor beeped steadily, and the room still had that cold, unsettling feel to it. I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone in there. The room, though empty of people, felt crowded, like there was something else present, something I could not see, but I knew was there. I told myself to focus on the task at hand, but as I prepared to leave again, it happened once more. His voice, weaker this time, but still distinct. Maggie, help me. My stomach churned. I knew for certain now that no one else was in the room, and yet the voice had come from him. I checked the monitors once more, my hands trembling. There was no sign of life, no spike in brain activity, no change in his condition. I called for the doctor immediately, feeling my heart pound in my chest. The doctor arrived, and together we confirmed once again that the man was indeed brain dead. There was no explanation for the whispers. As we stood there, in the dim light of the ICU, I could feel my hands growing clammy. The doctor ordered some tests to be sure, but it didn't change the fact that the man's condition was irreversible. We decided to let the family know, but when we stepped out of the room, the whispers stopped. For the rest of the shift, there was no sound from the man's room. I could not understand what had happened. Was it a hallucination, a trick of the mind? In a state of exhaustion, the next day, I tried to talk to some of my colleagues about it, but no one seemed to have an answer. All they could do was shrug and tell me that strange things happen in hospitals all the time. Maybe it was the patient's way of holding on for just a moment longer, or maybe it was a delayed response from his brain as it shut down. But I could not forget those whispers. I could not forget how real they had felt. Days later, after the patient had passed away and his family had gone, I was cleaning the room, preparing it for the next admission. As I wiped down the counter, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A faint imprint of a hand on the pillow, like someone had pressed their hand there in the moments before I arrived. I could not explain it. The room had been empty for hours, and the bed had been neatly made when I entered. Yet there it was, clear as day. It was the same handprint I had seen when I first walked in, as if the man had tried to reach out, as if he had wanted something, someone, before it was too late. I never forgot the whispers, and I never forgot the handprint. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was a last-ditch effort from a dying mind, a trick of the light, or something far darker, but I do know this. Hospitals are places where the line between life and death is often thinner than we think, and sometimes, just sometimes, the dead aren't as quiet as we'd like to believe. Hospitals are places where life and death meet, where every day is a delicate balance between the two. The sounds of monitors, the beeping of machines, and the hushed whispers of doctors and nurses make the atmosphere heavy, like time itself slows down in these halls. I had worked the night shift in the ICU for years, and like most seasoned nurses, I thought I had seen it all. There were moments of sorrow, moments of joy, and moments of utter quiet. But there was one night that would change the way I saw the hospital forever. It started like any other shift. My feet moved automatically from room to room, checking vitals, adjusting IV drips, and making sure everything was running smoothly. Most of the patients were asleep, their steady breathing and the hum of machines providing a strange comfort in the dead of night. But there was one room that night where something felt wrong. The patient was an older man who had been in a coma for several days. His family had been told to prepare for the worst. He was no longer responsive, and his body was slowly giving up. His heart rate was irregular, and his blood pressure was dangerously low. I had seen enough cases like this to know what was coming. The monitors would continue to beep for a while, and then there would be a moment of silence. That moment was always a signal of the inevitable. But something felt different this time. As I walked past the man's room, I noticed that the lights were flickering slightly, just enough to be unsettling. I paused for a moment, staring at the doorway. It was the kind of thing that could easily be explained away, maybe an issue with the hospital's electrical system, but something about it didn't sit right. I shook it off and continued with my rounds. A few hours later, I found myself back in the same hallway. The man's room was just ahead. I knew his condition hadn't improved, and it was likely only a matter of time before his heart would stop beating. As I approached the room, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There, standing just inside the doorway, was a shadow. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was more like a dark, shifting shape, just standing there, still and unmoving. My first instinct was to step back, but I froze. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but I couldn't deny it either. The shadow seemed to be hovering over the patient, as if watching him. It was too solid to be a trick of the light, and yet it was too vague to fully comprehend. I felt a knot form in my stomach, and my heart began to race. I told myself it was nothing, just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I stepped into the room, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. The man was still lying in bed, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The shadow remained, hanging over him like a dark omen. It was almost as if it was waiting for something, like it knew exactly what was about to happen. I checked the patient's vitals, hoping that the cold rush of routine would snap me out of my unease. But as I watched the monitor, the beeping grew more erratic. His heart rate dropped, then flatlined. The room fell silent. The shadow, however, remained. I stepped back in horror, my breath catching in my throat. I could feel my legs trembling beneath me. I knew what the flatline meant. I had seen it too many times before. But that shadow, that presence was something I couldn't explain. It felt wrong. I couldn't look away. My mind screamed for me to call for help, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadow. Then in the stillness of the room, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, a whisper, a murmur that sent chills down my spine. It was as if someone was speaking, but there was no one else in the room. The voice was low, distorted, and incomprehensible. I felt the air grow colder around me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I finally found the strength to turn away, to leave the room. But as I did, I heard the sound of the patient's heart monitor beep again, once more, a brief spike before it went silent. I didn't dare go back in. I called for the doctor to come immediately, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. But when the doctor arrived, the room was empty. The shadow was gone, and the patient had been pronounced officially deceased. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest that the strange presence I had felt was anything more than a product of my overworked mind. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what had happened. The nurses who worked the night shift with me began to whisper about that room. They spoke of strange occurrences, flickering lights, cold spots, and a sense of being watched. No one could explain it, but it wasn't long before the story of the shadow in that room became part of the hospital's unspoken history. I never returned to that room during a night shift again. I couldn't. To this day, I don't know if it was a ghost, a shadow of death itself, or something else entirely. But I do know that sometimes, in places where life and death meet, something else might be watching, waiting for the moment to claim what's left. And sometimes, that something doesn't leave when it's supposed to. Hospitals are full of strange occurrences, things that can't be explained. I have worked in one for over 10 years, and in all that time, I've heard more than my fair share of creepy stories. But there's one story I'll never forget, one that still haunts me to this day. It was late one evening during a quiet shift, the kind where everything seems calm, but there's an underlying tension in the air. The rooms were quiet, the lights dimmed, and the hospital felt almost empty. One of my patients, a young woman named Clara, had been in for a routine surgery. There was nothing unusual about her case, nothing that should have raised any concerns. She was in her mid-30s, with a cheerful demeanor, and her recovery was going smoothly. At least it seemed that way. It started when Clara asked for help to use the bathroom. It wasn't uncommon for patients who had recently undergone surgery to need assistance, so I helped her into the bathroom and made sure everything was safe. As I turned to leave, She stopped me. "Nurse," she said, her voice shaky, "can you stay with me for just a second? I feel like something is wrong." Her face was pale, her eyes wide with unease. I told her it was probably just the effects of the medication, that she was likely a little disoriented. She nodded, but the tension in her voice made me stay a moment longer. I stood by the door, watching her through the mirror. She was brushing her hair, looking at herself with an expression I couldn't quite place. It was as if she was trying to convince herself of something. That's when I noticed it. A small, almost imperceptible change in her reflection. Clara smiled at herself in the mirror, but the reflection did not mirror her. It wasn't just that the smile seemed off. It was as if the reflection was someone else entirely. The smile was too wide, too forced, and the eyes in the mirror didn't look like Clara's at all. They were cold, dark, almost empty, like a stranger was standing there behind her, watching me. I stepped closer to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Clara was still staring at her reflection, unaware of the change. I wanted to speak, to ask if she saw what I saw, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was intruding on something private, something I wasn't supposed to witness. The reflection in the mirror was no longer Clara. It was a different face, someone smiling at me with a twisted, unsettling grin. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I rushed to her side, telling her that everything was fine, trying to reassure her. But as I turned her around to face me, she froze. The look on her face was one of terror. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She pointed shakily at the mirror. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Someone else was smiling. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I turned to look at the mirror, but the reflection was normal now. Just Clara, looking back at me with her wide, frightened eyes. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I had seen it, or if I had imagined it, but I knew that the fear in her eyes was real. I helped Clara back to her bed, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what had happened. Was it the medication, or was there something more to it? I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a moment of confusion, a trick of the mind. But Clara wasn't the same after that. She became more withdrawn, more fearful. She wouldn't look in mirrors, wouldn't even go near the bathroom, unless someone was with her. I tried to speak to her about it, but she would only shake her head, refusing to talk about what she had seen. The days passed, and the incident started to fade from my mind, but I couldn't forget the look in her eyes, the terror that had overtaken her when she saw the stranger in the mirror. A week later, Clara was discharged, and I didn't see her again for several months. But one night, I was working late again, when I overheard a conversation at the nurse's station. Clara had been back in the hospital, this time for something unrelated. But she wasn't alone. She was with a man, her husband, I assumed. They were both talking in low voices, and I overheard Clara say something that made my blood run cold. "I saw it again," she said. "The reflection, the smile. It's not just me. It's like someone else is inside my head, watching me." It was then that I realized what had happened. Clara had seen something in that mirror, something that no one else could see. It wasn't just a trick of the light, or the medication. It was something else, something that had followed her from that night in the bathroom. And the most terrifying part, the reflection wasn't just a reflection, it was a warning that sometimes what we see in the mirror isn't just a reflection of ourselves. Sometimes, it's a glimpse of something darker, something waiting to step out from the other side. And sometimes it follows you, no matter how far you go. There is something eerie about the stillness of a hospital at night, when everything feels too quiet, too calm. I have worked as a nurse for several years now, and I thought I had seen everything: patients passing, family members grieving, and the strange, unexplainable occurrences that seem to happen only when the sun goes down. But there was one night, one moment, that I will never forget. It was a routine night shift, and I was making my rounds, checking on patients who were resting quietly in their rooms. The night was slow, almost too slow, and I found myself wandering through the hallways, lost in thought. One of my patients, an elderly woman named Mrs. Green, had been admitted the day before. She had fallen at home and was recovering from a hip injury. There was nothing unusual about her case, and she was in stable condition. I knocked gently before entering her room. She was awake, but barely. She had a habit of dozing off between short bursts of conversation, and tonight was no different. I made sure her IV was properly hooked up, checked her vitals, and adjusted the blankets over her legs. As I was finishing up, Mrs. Green mumbled something, barely audible, as if speaking in her sleep. I bent down closer to hear her, expecting to catch something about her family or a request for water, but what she said sent a chill down my spine. "It's under the bed. Don't let it touch you." I froze. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was shallow, but she continued muttering, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's cold, so cold." My heart raced. I quickly stood up and tried to shake off the creeping unease. She had been through a lot in the past few days: pain, medication, and the stress of being away from home. It wasn't unusual for patients to talk in their sleep, but something about the way she said it, something about the way she kept saying cold, made me hesitate. I checked her vital signs again, reassuring myself that there was nothing physically wrong. She was just tired. I left the room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was just a few minutes later when I found myself standing by Mrs. Green's bed once again. The hospital felt unnaturally quiet now. I glanced down at the floor, seeing nothing unusual, but as I took a step back from her bed, something happened that I could not explain. I felt it, a cold, icy grip around my ankle. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I had been tired, my mind was worn thin from the long hours, and I had no reason to be afraid. But the grip tightened, and it was as if something or someone was pulling at me from underneath the bed. I gasped and tried to pull my foot away, but the pressure was too strong. It felt like a hand, cold and clammy, wrapping around my ankle. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked down, trying to understand what was happening. But when I glanced under the bed, there was nothing there. No one. The space was empty, nothing but the shadows and the dust. I quickly stepped back, my hands shaking, and I looked around the room. Mrs. Green was still lying motionless on the bed, her eyes closed, as though she hadn't noticed anything strange. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself, but the feeling didn't go away. That icy grip lingered, as if I could still feel the cold fingers wrapped around my ankle. It was then that I noticed something even stranger. The temperature in the room had dropped, and I could see my breath in the air, a mist of white hanging in front of me. I didn't know what to do. The only thing I knew was that I needed to leave that room. I didn't even check on the other patients that night. I just went straight to the nurse's station and tried to compose myself. The rest of the shift was uneventful. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Who would believe me? It was just a moment of fear, brought on by exhaustion, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened in that room, something I couldn't explain. 2 days later, Mrs. Green passed away. She had been comfortable, and her death was expected. Her family was notified, and we made sure she was treated with the utmost respect in her final hours. But before they left, her daughter pulled me aside. "You know, my mother kept talking about something under the bed," she said, her voice soft. She was so frightened of it. She kept saying it was cold. My blood ran cold. I tried to smile and reassure her, but deep down, I knew what I had felt. I had felt it too. I never spoke about the cold hand again, and I never returned to that room alone. I couldn't. That night, I realized something I hadn't wanted to believe, that sometimes in places like hospitals, where the boundaries between life and death are so thin, there are things that don't leave when they're supposed to, and sometimes they reach out to touch you, even when you're not ready for them.